Welcome everybody, my name is Niclas Huschenbeth and in this video I would like to show you the highlights of the 2014 World Chess Championship between Magnus Carlsen and Viswanathan Anand played in November 2014. So I will share with you what I believe to be the critical moments and the turning points of the match where both players missed chances and could have improved their play. So let's get started with game 1. Anand started game 1 with first d4 and Carlsen replied with the Grünfeld defense. Anand was really well prepared and we see he was able to build up some pressure. The position is dynamically unbalanced. You can see the white pawn structure is very destroyed. He's having a lot of isolated pawns, so this is bad because the pawns cannot protect each other and are weak and can be easily attacked and maybe won. But on the other hand, white is having this very strong bishop on e6, which is controlling the only open file at the moment, the c file, and is very unpleasant for black. And at this point Carlsen found a really nice maneuver to get rid of this bishop. He played rook d6 with the idea to play knight d8, and he was able to exchange the bishop, and then white was left with some weaknesses. And actually, we will fast forward now a little bit, but Carlsen was able to continuously improve his position, and even though with reduced material, he was able to pose some problems to the white position. We will actually go to this moment. You can see some material has come off the board. Not a lot of materials left, but Carlsen was still able to create something. This was a really critical point because here he could have achieved a really good position with the black pieces. He played the move rook e2 and then Anand was able to just defend his position in time. But if Carlsen had played rook to e3 instead, he would have had really good chances. For now, there's the threat of rook takes a3, king takes a3 and queen b3 mate. So white has to cope with that. And he has to play rook b4. Or he has another option as well. Let's have a look at both options. So rook b4 would be a natural move. Attack the pawn on b7, but now we can see the other idea. Not only rook takes a3 was a threat, but also rook b3. Now black's threatening checkmate, white has to take, pawn takes, and we reach this endgame, which is clearly favorable for black. Now this is actually just horrible. We will just in a moment see the same position after rook d7 check. Here white is reaching the same position. At least he is having an extra pawn, but still this is very unpleasant for white to play because this pawn is so strong on b3, restricting the white king, and there are always mating ideas, and I believe black is having excellent chances in the queen's endgame. But Carlsen missed this chance and he played rook e2, which also looks attractive, but now rook b4, b5, and now Anand found a really precise defensive move here. The only move which is keeping the position equal, queen h1, amazing move. The idea is the queen needs to become active, and somehow white wants to create counterplay against the black king. And Carlsen didn't find anything better here but to shortly allow a move repetition here at this point. Now he's threatening checkmate, but white is just in time, and with his queen maneuver he was able to give a perpetual here, and the first game ended in a draw. Alright, let's go to game 2. Game 2, Carlsen with the white pieces. He started with first e4, Anand replied with e5, and we see an anti-Berlin variation on the board. So that means Carlsen did not go for the Berlin endgame, which we will see later in the match. He played a quiet line. Not much has happened. We see the position is quite symmetrical, but white is having some options here, and Carlsen played a really interesting idea. He played rook a3, and with this move he's showing his ambitions to attack the black king. And just in a few moves, you can see that his pieces are all move forward to the black king. Queen h5, now the rook is coming over here, and in pretty much no time Carlsen has built up a very strong attack, and Anand really was under pressure. And we will fast forward now to the next critical moment. Carlsen continuously built up the pressure, and in the end we go to 34th move. At this point, white is clearly better. What's going on here? White is really active, the black king is weak. This pawn on f3 might fall sooner or later, but here Anand played an incredible mistake. He gave away the game immediately. He could have still put on a good fight. He played the move h5, but this just allows queen b7. There's absolutely no defense against rook takes g7, followed pretty much by mate, so Anand had to resign. If he had played the move queen d2, he could have still fought on for a really long time. There was definitely a critical moment. He couldn't stand the pressure anymore, and he made a decisive mistake. And this is actually a way Carlsen oftentimes wins his games. He just plays on, tries to build up pressure, and he succeeded in doing so. And then eventually humans all make mistakes, and this is exactly what happened to Anand. After queen e2, it's long not over here. Let's see some sample lines. For example, maybe the best option for white could be to go for rook endgame here with queen e3. And now rook takes e3 or f takes e3 is possible. In both cases, white will win this pawn on f2, but it's a rook endgame, and there's a high draw tendency in rook endgame since long not over. So Carlsen won game 2 and took the lead with 1.5 to 1/2. Game 3. Game 3, Anand with the white piece again started with first d4, and this time Carlsen didn't choose the Grünfeld but played the declined Queen's Gambit, and we see this position. And this is the critical moment. Anand had a absolutely outstanding preparation here. If it was black's move, he could play b5 and no worries at all, he's absolutely fine. But at this point, Anand sacrificed the pawn with b5 and now c6, and this is the whole idea. This pawn will become very strong, supported by the bishop. Black has to play queen c8 to pin the pawn, but the pawn moves forward to c7, and now you can see the bishop is supporting it, and black is not able to get rid of this pawn easily. And Anand was very well prepared. He was prepared for about 22 moves, and then he played very precisely. Let's go to next critical moment. At this point you can see white has kept the very strong pawn on c7, and black is also having some play with the pawn on a3, which is not quite as advanced. Still, all the white pieces are very active. White has placed the rook on c6, completely restricting black's options, and Carlsen was struggling to find counterplay. He played the interesting try bishop b4. Now their idea is bishop a5, bishop d2 maybe, and here Anand played very precisely. He played rook a1. It's a very strong prophylactic move, because now bishop d2 obviously is not an option. White could just take off the pawn on a3, and at this point actually Carlsen couldn't stand the pressure anymore and made a decisive mistake. He would need to be patient here, but this is of course really difficult. He would need to play waiting moves like h6, but he played bishop a5. He just wanted to get rid of this pawn on c7, but he ends up in this deadly pin on the c file, and the game was over pretty soon because there's just no way black is getting out of it. He gave the exchange on e5, but still he is in this pin, and he had to resign shortly after rook c1. There is no hope. Black is losing more material and is simply lost. So Anand was able to immediately bounce back after his loss in game 2 with a win in game 3. So the score is 1.5 to 1.5. Let's see game 4. Game 4, Carlsen again with the white pieces playing first e4, and this time Anand replied with the Sicilian, and Carlsen played a close Sicilian. He didn't go for the main lines, and we see this position. Black is having an isolated pawn on d5, but his pieces are all very well placed and he doesn't have any problems here, definitely. All his pieces are in the natural squares and he's absolutely fine. Carlsen at this point decided to change the character of the position by taking on c6 and playing c4. And indeed, he was able to create something. And there was one critical moment where he really could have had a nice advantage. So let's fast forward to this moment. Just right here. You can see some pieces have come off the board. Still, white is having this slightly better pawn structure. These pawns are still isolated and again cannot protect each other and are vulnerable. And here Carlsen allowed some more exchanges by playing knight h4. If he played bishop c3 instead, just this calm retreat, he could have had a really pleasant position. This move is allowing pieces to go to d4 now, the knight or the queen, and also there's pressure on the d file. Let's say, for example, now if rook d8, now knight h4, bishop takes g2, king takes g2, knight f5 is an idea, the idea is on the d file. Black is having some problems here. But Carlsen missed this chance, and then Anand put up a really good defense and didn't really have any problems anymore. They reach a queen's endgame at this point, and here Anand decided to sacrifice a pawn, but in queen endgames, this is how I should say it, what really is important is who is having the stronger pawn, and in this case it's clearly black with the pawn on d4. He's having enough counterplay here, and Carlsen had to agree to draw pretty soon. He still tried to play it on here with h4, but now Anand just took on a2 and the queen came back to d2, clearly supporting the pawn in advancing, and Carlsen decided to give a perpetual here with the queen, and the game ended in a draw. So after game 4 the score is 2-2. Game 5, Anand with the white pieces again. Of course he sticks to first d4, he just won a game with the white pieces, so the question is how would Carlsen respond, and he played actually a new opening. He played the Queen's Indian. We reached this position, white is slightly better, and here Anand found a nice way to keep the pressure with c takes d5, knight takes e5, and now a really nice intermediate move I want to show you, d6. And the point is that black cannot take this pawn because of bishop takes b7 and double attack on the rook and the knight. And he can also not take the bishop really because of d takes e7, queen takes e7, d takes e5, and again two pieces of black are attacked, and if he takes on f1, white is ending up with two pieces against the rook, and he's better here. So with this move Anand kept the pressure, won back the piece on e7, and he played really good in this phase of the game. And then he sacrificed a pawn. Let me show you. He sacrificed a pawn at this point by playing queen f3. And even though the position is symmetrical, white is having a bishop, and the bishop against the knight, especially in this kind of position where the knight doesn't have a nice outpost where he's protected, the side with the bishop is having a slight advantage. Here Carlsen took on b2. It's quite dangerous, but he did it. And after rook 81, White is having all kinds of threats. Bishop takes f7, rook e7, and Anand actually had to retreat with Carlsen had to retreat with queen f6, and he ended up in an unpleasant endgame, but surprisingly, Anand didn't really make it very difficult for Carlsen. What you need to know about this endgame, as long as White is able to keep some pawns on the queen side, he should be better, because the bishop is just better able to play on both sides of the board than the knight. Of course, because the bishop can move long distances very easily, while the knight is not able to do so. And here Anand took on a7 and allowed the knight to come back into the game. If he played rook c7, he would also win back the pawn later, but he would keep the pawn on a2 on the board, and I believe that would have been quite an unpleasant defensive task for Carlsen. But he missed his chance, and soon you can see here the knight comes back, and now all pawns on the queen side come off the board, and this is just not enough for White to do anything. The black structure is a little bit weakened, but all the pawns are on one side. Now Black has to just make sure his knight is not trapped, which he is not. Now he's coming back, and after a few exchanges here, soon both players agreed to a draw. Alright, and we reach this position, and next move, White will take on e3, but here Carlsen offered a draw, which was accepted by Anand. So Anand missed a little chance here, but still the match is tied 2.5 to 2.5. Let's go to game 6. Game 6, Carlsen again first e4, and Anand again replied with the Sicilian, but this time Carlsen wanted to see which Sicilian Anand had prepared and played the open Sicilian, and Anand went for a variation which was not really a good way to play against Carlsen, because he reached an endgame which is exactly what he likes to play. Slightly better position, he can build up the pressure, and this is exactly what he did. You can see all his pieces are in good squares, the pawn on h6 is weak, White is having the bishop here. But here a move happened which will be remembered for a very long time, and it is definitely one of the decisive moments in the entire match. Carlsen played king to d2 with the idea to bring the king to the king side and support his pawns. But this move has a major flaw. Black can pretty much reach a winning position here. But Anand missed it. He played too fast, he was too focused on pushing his pawn forward, and he missed this great opportunity. He played a4. He could have taken on e5, and the point is with the king on d2, there's now a check on c4. Let's have a look. Okay, so for now, rook takes e5 doesn't work because the rook on g4 is hanging. So White has to move the rook. And if he takes on g8, now we see the whole point why king d2 was a blunder, because now Black can take on c4 with check. King attacks the knight, but again the knight moves with check to b2. The king has to move again, and now Black takes back the rook, and he has won 2 pawns in the process. The game is not entirely over yet, but this should be objectively winning for Black, and a win with the black pieces would have been so huge for Anand, so huge. But he missed this chance, and both players immediately after they played their moves, they noticed what they had done, which great opportunity both missed, or well, Anand missed and Carlsen allowed. And they both said in the press conference that this really influenced their play in this game. Carlsen continued with some maneuvers, and Anand was really under the influence of this mistake. He didn't play his best, and at this point Anand tried to exchange bishops, but now check, and here really the best chance for black was to give the exchange. It's surprising, but to give the exchange, and then black can invade on d1, and he still has chance because the bishop on a3 is kind of out of play and might be lost in some variations. And definitely white is having a not so easy task to convert his advantage here. But Anand played his bishop back, which is a natural move, but in this case white just took in g6 and black is not having enough counterplay. And we will see that now Carlsen just took off all the pawns off the board with pretty much every move he's taking a pawn, and his bishop is not even trapped. This was maybe Anand's hope, but after rook takes a2, which he didn't play, the bishop can just go back to c1. He is not trapped. And Anand still tried bishop c2, but now rook e7 check, and the game is over. Anand resigned because after king a6, rook takes h6, white is already up 4 pawns, plus the pawn on c5 is hanging. It is just completely over. This was really one of the decisive moments in the match, this moment in the 26 move where both players missed a chance. So Carlsen took the lead 3.5 to 2.5. Let's go to game 7. Game 7, Carlsen again with the white piece because there was a break in between. The first half of the match was played, and the second half of the match Carlsen this time started with the white piece because Anand had started the first half of the match with the white pieces. And again Carlsen went for e4 and Anand returned to the Berlin Wall, and this time actually Carlsen went for the endgame, as you can see on the board, and they played a very topical line, theoretical line. Carlsen was very well prepared, and we see this is a critical moment. White is now threatening to take on e5 and having 2 connected pawns here on the king side, and Anand made the right choice here. He played bishop takes g4. He gave his bishop up for the 2 pawns and hoped to build up a fortress, playing b6, and there's not a lot of material left on the board, and actually Anand had to defend this position for another 90 moves, but eventually he reached the draw, and that was very important for Anand to not lose the second game in a row, to stay in the match, and he showed that he's able to defend against Carlsen. Carlsen tried for a very long time. In the end he even played the endgame rook knight against the rook, which is known as relatively easy to defend for black, but he even tried this, but Anand kept his cool and managed to hold the draw. So after game 7 the score was 4 to 3 for Carlsen. Game 8. Again Anand with first d4, and Carlsen returned to the declined queen's gambit as he did in game 3, but he played a different line. This is a critical point here. After queen c2, the main line clearly is queen a5, but Carlsen had prepared this move rook e8, which is not too unnatural. Black is preparing e5 followed by d4, and he prepared this little sideline to surprise Anand, and it worked out very well. He didn't have any problems, and shortly after he took off all the pieces off the board. Position was symmetrical. We can see this position here. Carlsen played another precise move here with b4, now offering a queen's exchange, and just all the pieces came off the board pretty much. I can show you right here, and they played on for a little bit, but nothing happened here. And of course this game is equal, and in the 4D first move, at this point Anand offered a draw, which was accepted by Carlsen. So Carlsen still in the lead after 8 games with 4.5 to 3.5. Game 9, again Carlsen with the white piece, and again he went for the Berlin endgame. We see it on the board right here. And in game 7 he played the move bishop f4, but now he tried knight e2. But Anand showed he was very well prepared. He played b6, and while in the last game Carlsen didn't have any problems with black, this time Anand had even less problems. Already after 60 moves, at this point Anand went for a move repetition. He gave a check on g5, king f6, knight e4 check, king f7, knight g5. Both sides don't really have a good way to deviate from the repetition, and they agreed to draw. Which is fine for Carlsen because he's still in the lead after 9 games with 5 to 4. And remember, the player to win the match only needs 6.5. So time was running out for Anand. Game 10, Anand with the white pieces once again, first d4, and Carlsen returned actually to the Grünfeld defense as he had played in game 1. And there were several critical moments in this game. Anand went for the Russian variation, which is known as very sharp, and you can see on the board it's quite unbalanced. White is having this possibly strong pawn on d5, a passed pawn which is supported by the rook. Black is having some active play with his pieces. And at this point Anand took on e4, but probably the immediate advance of the pawn to d6 would have been quite strong. Notice that black can't really take on d6 because queen f4, and he's in this really unpleasant pin. And let's say bishop f8, I can take on a6 and just increase the pressure here on the knight on d6, and black's having huge problems. So most likely black should take on c3, but compared to the game, at least the queen is still on an active square on c4, and I believe white is having quite good chances here. He's definitely having an advantage. I don't know how much, but this will not be an easy task for black. However, Anand took on e4 and missed this chance. Soon after they reached an endgame, which was still quite complicated. Here we have the endgame. You can see the pawn on b2 was exchanged against the pawn on h6. White is still having the strong d pawn, which is really his asset in this position. Knight b4, Carlsen is returning the knight to a better square, and I believe this is the critical moment. Here Anand played too cautiously. He played rook d2, just protecting the pawn on a2, but he has to go for some immediate action, rook fe1, occupying the e-file and having this idea of rook e7. And just to show you, if for example knight takes a2, this can become pretty interesting. White is having a strong pawn on e7, which is supported by the bishops, and definitely white is having some chances here. Still, position is very unclear. There's also some risk involved for white, of course, but if you don't go for any risks, you won't win a game. And I feel like this is what happened in this particular game. Black doesn't have to take on a2. He can also go for something like rook a8. But now at least white has occupied the e-file, and let's say a3, knight c6, h4, and black sooner or later pretty much has to give the exchange on d6. And white is having the advantage obviously, but it will be far from easy to convert it. But clearly it's only white who's playing for win, and he can definitely try something here. In the game, however, Carlsen didn't really have big problems. He contained the pawn on d6, he blocked it, and now he exchanged the defender on f4 with bishop e5. And here Anand decided to simplify matters by taking on b7. Rook takes d7. Now the knight has to come back, and we reach this endgame with 4 rooks on the board, but neither side is having any material advantage and a draw was agreed. So Anand missed his chances in this game to build up some more pressure, to make it more difficult for Carlsen to hold a draw. That was the 10th game. The score 5.5 to 4.5. That means game 11 was a match point for Carlsen, because if he was to win this game, he would be the world champion. And once again, he went for the Berlin endgame, or you can also say Anand allowed the Berlin endgame. And Anand was well prepared. He pretty much reached a perfect Berlin setup, Berlin endgame setup. You can see here his position is very solid, and this is why it's called the Berlin Wall, because there's just no easy way to crack it. And here Anand found a beautiful resource. He played b5. Can you believe it? The pawn can be taken by a4 or c4 pawn, but in either way black is having some dangerous play. Let's have a look. If a takes b5, then the rook on the a file is coming into play here. Rook takes a4. Now you can see the rook is active and black is having more than enough compensation for the pawn. If however c takes b5, then c6, and suddenly the knight on d5 is not protected enough anymore. The knight has to retreat, and if the knight moves, then the pawn on b3 is hanging. Black is winning back the pawn, and a huge factor in this endgame is, a huge advantage for black is oftentimes this bishop pair. And the bishop pair really is only of importance if black is able to open the position, if diagonals open up, if files open up, and this is exactly the case here, and black is already clearly better. So Carlsen actually kept the position close. He simply played bishop c3, and Anand took king c6, king f3. Interesting maneuver by Carlsen to bring the king close to the center. Now Anand occupied the b file very naturally, and here a moment, the next definitely decisive moment of the match. Well, not quite yet, but very surprising decision here by Anand. He played rook b4. He sacrificed an exchange. And that was not necessary. He is by no means worse. He can, for example, play a move like rook b3. Game most likely should end in a draw. If he really wants to push here, he can rather sacrifice the exchange at this point. And at least he is immediately gaining a pawn for it, which is not the case in the game. And position remains very complex. All 3 results are possible. But he doesn't have to do it. There was still 1 game left. And this last game, the 12th game, he would have played with the white pieces. So he didn't have to go all in. But exactly this seems to be the case here. He played rook b4, and a decision which he most likely regrets afterwards now. Carlsen took him b4, and now this is actually indeed the real mistake. Rook b4 is still possible, even though it's dangerous, but here taking back with the c-pawn is definitely not a good choice. Black has to take with the a-pawn, which is actually more natural, because now you open up the a-file for the rook and you have some play against the pawn, and this is still highly complex, and black is certainly having chances, and it might very well be around equals though. But after c takes b5, black is not having enough compensation here. He is having a protected pawn on b4, but that's about it. And Carlsen played absolutely world-class chess from this point forward till the end of the game. He played so strong. He absolutely showed why he is the world champion. He played world-class chess. So let's see what happened here. Knight h5 with the idea to push f4 to open up the position, because rooks need open files to become effective. King b7, f4. He goes immediately for some action here. And he gives the pawn on c4, but it's all about activity. It's all about activity. Rook's becoming active. You can see now rook is coming to a c file. The rook on the 7th rank is very strong. And Anand is facing a pretty much impossible defensive task here. Let's see how this game concluded. And there was a little nice tactic at this point. Rook takes c7, rook takes c7, knight takes c7, and the point is, if black now takes with the king, then rook c1 will win back one of the two bishops on the c-file. A nice tactic, still Anand tried on, but Carlsen, he kept his cool, he played very precisely. And we reached this position. You might think black is still having some hope with his connected pawns on the queen side, but no. White is too fast here with his own play, and the pawns are contained by the king and the rook, and now white is simply pushing his own pawns here, and these pawns are stopped. White is planning to move forward, and there's nothing black can do. Bishop b4 would win the rook, but would allow white to queen a pawn, and of course it's all over. So after 45 king c3, Viswanathan resigned and Magnus Carlsen defended his title and stays world champion. A very exciting match. Carlsen throughout the match played the better chess, but as you saw, Anand had his chance, but it seems sometimes he didn't really believe in his chance. He just made it sometimes too easy for Carlsen to defend, and he didn't try too much. And then in the decisive moments, in the critical moments we had seen, he sometimes made the wrong choices, or he simply committed a mistake. So Magnus Carlsen, the deserved winner of this match, will stay the world champion. I hope you enjoyed this highlight show. I tried to summarize the whole match pretty much in one video. Let me know if I succeeded. Let me know if you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then feel free to subscribe to my channel to not miss any of my upcoming videos. Alright guys, see you soon. Bye.